Pastor Sarah Matthews.
I'm John Ferris, I was born here.
They had a city of a long time old baby.
Untitled Living.
Carol Moore.
Carol Moore. And Dean, y'all introduce yourself to our two.
Dean Julie.
Bruce Smith.
Bruce Smith. Very good.
And the ones on the.
And hello, everybody in video land. We're glad you're here. So let's offer a word of thanks. Gracious God, we are always grateful to be gathered around your word. May it inspire us, give us good hopes. And we're grateful this day that we can celebrate mothers, those who have been so important to us and functioned as our mothers. We give you thanks for them. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, today we are looking at Acts 22 through 24. There are a couple of Bibles over there if you're interested. And we're kind of coming close to the end of our study. And we're now in that section of Acts where it's all Paul all the time, you know.
What page are we on?
We're on Acts 22. And if you have one of these blue Bibles, it's page 143. Yeah, 143. When the book of Acts was written, maybe in the 80s or the 90s, we're not quite sure. One of the questions that faced the church that was a significant question was, when you're hauled before the authorities, whether they're religious authorities or political authorities, what are you supposed to say? Or how is it you defend yourself against these accusations of all kinds, right? And in 1 Peter 3:14, he talks about when you make a defense of the faith. The word there, defense, is apologia. So when you talk about an apology for the faith, you're not begging for forgiveness. You're saying, this is my defense. So in this section, Paul's going to make a defense of his faith in several different situations. One is going to be kind of a religious setting, a religious court, and the other is going to be a political court. And you're going to see that he offers different tactics when he is in different settings, as we would ourselves, right? And so one of the things that it's important in reading Acts is to think of it as kind of a handbook for the church of the 90s, that when you are faced with difficulties or accusations, how is it you're supposed to respond? And remember, there was local sporadic persecution of the Christian church in the 60s under Nero, but it really got serious in the 90s under the Emperor Domitian. The Emperor Domitian is the emperor under whom the book of Revelation was probably penned, meaning in the 90s, it got very intense, very intense. And in fact, you may, if you're interested, the worst persecution in the history of the church actually happened in the late 290s when Diocletian was the emperor, and this was very serious. And that persecution led to Constantine reacting against it, and then he becomes emperor, and he ends persecution and gives the church favored status. So in the old bromide, it's darkest right before the dawn. You know, the Diocletian persecution in the 290s was the worst, and it led, strangely enough, to Constantine. Now, whether or not we should be happy that Constantine baptized the church and made it an arm of the empire, well, that's another story. But anyway, so so what we have here are kind of localized situations. Okay, so in Acts 22, if you remember, Paul has been arrested in the temple, and this is his defense to a mob that wanted to kill him. I mean, imagine this. You know, they're taking him off to jail, basically. He says, oh, listen, before you take me off to jail, I just have a few words for the mob that wanted to kill me. Yeah, if you would listen, please. So listen to the part of this. Brothers and sisters, listen to the defense that I now make before you. The word there is apologia in Greek. When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Then he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, and brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. And I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them, I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. Okay, so Aristotle in the Rhetoric said the most important rule for a speaker is know your audience. Know your audience. So know your audience, point one is you speak in their language. Now remember, Paul had dual language capacity. He could speak and write Greek, and he could speak and write, probably this means Aramaic, which was a kind of a blend of Persian and Hebrew. I've often described Aramaic, that's the language Jesus spoke. And you get a couple of Aramaic phrases in the New Testament, right? Abba, Laba, Sabachthani. But I've often described Aramaic as sort of Tex-Mex. It's got a combination of English and Spanish, and you end up with Spanglish or Tex-Mex. Aramaic is Persian plus Hebrew. And the half of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. That's the only part of the Old Testament that's not Hebrew. And Daniel was written because of the Persian influence. Israel was under Persian domination for about 300 years. Okay, so a lot of that language borrowed. So he stands up.
No mention of Latin.
No, there's no mention of Latin. Oh, by the way, I was reading a theological book the other day written by a Roman Catholic theologian, great theologian, and she said that she was talking about Jesus as a Jew. It's kind of like, this is self-evident. Jesus is a Jew. Paul's a Jew. Peter's a Jew. All the earlier followers of Jesus are Jews. And this one kid in the class raised his hand and says, well, I thought, that Jesus was a Jew, but right before he died, he became a Catholic. I said that for you, Brita. Okay. right before he died a good Catholic, a good standing.
And once a Catholic,
always a Catholic, right?
You don't dare change.
That's right. So Jesus is Catholic to the end of days, right? Okay. So this defense is done in their language. And then the second part of the defense that's important is that Paul, links up his former life with the high priest who had given him a commission to go to Damascus and bring home these renegade, Christian sect folks, right? And bring them back to be prosecuted. Okay, so notice the beauty of that. I was educated here in Jerusalem. I was under the feet of Gamaliel. I speak your language. I was told by the high priest I could go to Damascus and bring back these recalcitrant. Is that a great way to start or what? In other words, I was one of you and zealous for the law, just like you. And then he's going to basically say, until I met the risen Christ. And then everything changed. And by the way, let me say this emphatically. Paul never stopped being a Jew. He became a Jewish Christian on the road to Damascus. He never stopped being a Jew. Why is he in the temple in the first place in Acts 21? Remember?
And could it be because Christ, our Lord, preached in the temple?
Certainly that models what Paul did. Paul went to the temple to participate in a sacrifice. His last public free act is as a Jewish worshiper who happens to be a member of the Christian sect of Judaism. So think of Christianity as a sect of Judaism in the same way the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes were sects, S-E-C-T-S, right? He's a member of the way. which is a Jewish sect, meaning he's a Jewish Christian to the day he dies.
Or in modern terms, a Messianic Jew.
In a way, a Messianic Jew, yeah, in some respects. So he's there, and then when he tells his story of having his life turned around in Damascus, they listen to him until, if you look at verse 21, the problem is not that he's a Jew. The problem is he's told, then he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. That's the showstopper. That's the bridge too far. And that's when they start shouting and saying, let's kill this guy. And at that point, the Roman soldiers have to literally take him away. Otherwise, he would have been mobbed yet again. The key point here is, y'all, he's accused falsely of bringing Trophimus the Ephesian, who's a Gentile, into the court of the Jews, where only Jews could be in the temple. And he's taken out. They're about to stone him for that violation. And then in his speech, he leads up gently to the fact that, wait, I've been called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Gentiles triggers what Acts 21 says was a charge against him, which was bringing a Gentile into the court of the Jews. So they go crazy. And at that point, what do? They just simply take him off and say, listen, we've got to keep this guy safe. And then they're about to do something interesting. They're about to beat him, because beating people with rods was kind of the way that Roman soldiers kind of disciplined the people in their mind. And they tie him up. They're about to beat him with rods. And Paul says, look, is this how you treat a Roman citizen? And they don't know he's a Roman citizen. And so, you'll be so glad to hear this, Art. They follow the rules and procedure and say, oh yes, we will now remand him back to jail. We'll not beat him with rods. By the way, in that chapter 22, there are two things about Paul that never show up in his letters. One is the idea that he was educated under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. We never hear that in the letters. And the other one in the letters is we never hear he's a Roman citizen. You only get those two bits of information from Acts, right? So he's now taken away, and then the next chapter 23 is this. He's taken to the Sanhedrin. Do y'all remember the Sanhedrin? This is the group that condemned Jesus, right? This is the group that condemned Peter and John earlier, right? The Sanhedrin would say in law, is not a unbiased court. This is a court that's already made up its mind that they don't like what's going on in the Christian movement. So now he goes from a mob that wanted to kill him to a Sanhedrin that's already judged Jesus, who's been crucified, and they probably would have done the same to Peter and John if they could have. But remember they had a jailbreak, they got out and all that. Well, now they have their shot at Paul. And Paul now is going to defend himself to a religious court that's already condemned Jesus. And at one point, Paul starts off by saying, listen, I come before you as someone who has a clear conscience. Now, clear conscience in Greek doesn't mean sinless. It just means I have been a faithful Jew is really what it means. And one of the soldiers slaps him, right? And he responds by turning the other cheek, right? No. He had not gotten that memo. No. He says, you whitewashed wall, blah, blah, blah. What are you doing this for? You're, in other words, he does the same thing he did to the Roman soldiers. You're going to beat me without a trial. And then he says, you're going to slap me without a due process. And they go, don't you realize that was the high priest Annas who told us to slap you? Oh, I didn't realize it was the high priest. So sorry. Quote scripture. I can never speak ill of the high priest, etc. But then, here's what I want you to know. Matthew 5 is Jesus saying, turn the other cheek, when you're assaulted. Guess what? In John 18, when Jesus is in front of the religious authorities and they slap him, does he turn the other cheek? No. He challenges them. Why are you doing this? In Acts 23, when Paul is slapped, he challenges the people who slap him. So what do you make of that? Now, Sermon on the Mount says, if someone slaps you on the right, turn your left, right? Paul doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't do that in John 18.
He doesn't slap them though.
No. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. He doesn't retaliate, but he challenges the people who do it unjustly. Here's what I'm trying to say. I think that there was a diversity of opinion in the early church about this issue. It's not like, Matthew has written it, now it's been disseminated to everybody, and now we're all on the same table. No, that really wasn't the case. In fact, when Paul is confronted by slapping and Jesus is slapped, they both challenge. So here's my thought here. Neither Paul nor Jesus are allow themselves to be rolled over unjust sort of actions. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Exactly. They challenge both of them that they're doing this in a sense illegally and without due process. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe in personal settings where somebody accuses you wrongly, or it's kind of a private setting, maybe the Sermon on the Mount has some relevance, you know what I mean? But if it's in a public setting, which was the case with Jesus and Paul, and by the way, it's the same Sanhedrin that does this both times. They challenge the Sanhedrin to abide by its actual policies, which is to say the law of Moses.
And they're both saying, I'm a good Jew.
And they're both saying, you've accused me wrongly. What I'm trying to say is, sometimes we get a vision of Christianity that involves passivity. Please walk over me, please roll up at your sleeve and slap me as long as you. And you know what? I don't see Paul or Jesus actually doing that. Have I missed something?
But they don't retaliate.
They do not retaliate. They do
The
not.
civil rights movement. I
Right.
mean, Martin Luther King.
He said the same thing, right? And by the way, I'm just trying to suggest, y'all, that one of the objections I've heard to Christianity is this kind of passivity notion, that if someone does something wrong, you just roll over and all that. But I actually don't see that happening in the case of Paul or Jesus, and in many other instances. In fact, Paul has so much chutzpah, if y'all remember earlier in the book of Acts, when he's wrongly imprisoned in Philippi, and they want to run him out of town quietly. Do you remember what he does? He says, oh, no, I'm sitting here in jail until the mayor of the city comes and apologizes. And remember that? It's the ultimate chutzpah, right? So I don't know, what are you thinking here? But the key point is neither retaliate, right? But both challenge.
I think it's really complicated because, I know in my own life, sometimes I tell people that they're wrong.
Yeah.
Or the action was not
Yeah.
correct and I expected an apology.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I never got an apology and I'm still mad. So,
So it's really worked well for you, Diane.
Of this, and this was even recently when my dogs were attacked by 3 other dogs and I was hurt badly. And I wrote to the homeowners association. They did talk to a person, but this person never wrote a note of apology. You sit there and you find yourself seething that they don't realize how much they hurt you and how they didn't follow the law.
Right.
And or care. Well, they got cured, but they were not on top of it.
They weren't diligent.
3 dogs are too many for any one person.
Exactly.
And, so but you do feel a need to say,
Yeah.
this is the law.
Exactly.
These are the boundaries that we're supposed to
Yeah.
interact under. And what you did was not good enough, you know.
That's right. And Jesus and Paul do exactly that.
Well, my children get really mad at me when I do this, you know, because then I make the situation uncomfortable.
Got it.
So,
Discomfort isn't always a bad thing.
That discomfort. Yeah, I'm thinking
well,
that.
we're all the same team. but-
Right. Every Sunday after church, I go visit my my friend in my neighborhood who I gave up on church years ago, but he always wants me to come and visit with him after church and tell him what happened at church. And we have coffee together and we sit in his backyard. Well, his backyard, a next door neighbor has a chicken. A chicken in the backyard. And the whole time we're talking is, you know, that sound, you know. And he said to me finally, he says, I'm going to the police tomorrow. I've gone to him a million times and said, this chicken is out of zoning. You know, there's a certain kind of zone. And now, if you live in Corrals, you can have anything you want, pigs, dogs, horses, but not in the Northeast Heights, you know what I mean? And so it's a,
Oh,
yeah, yeah,
they're okay.
yeah. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, he's tried every way he can, you know, personal way, but tomorrow, that last week, he was going to the cops, you know. I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes we get kind of a strange picture of Christianity as being sort of, oh, please abuse me, I really want that. But you don't see that in Jesus, and you don't see that in Paul. Paul even more so. Paul,
I find that Christianity is hopefully a good way to run your life, you know, and I think I certainly learned, if you think I'm skinny now, you should have seen me when I was in middle school, you know, you might have been different, but I got challenged a few times and I wasn't gonna retaliate.
Right, yeah.
usually. So you had to learn,
yeah,
you know, how to.
pick your spots. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, you had to learn how to talk your way out of something.
yeah,
you
that's
know,
right.
Because it wasn't that easy, and that's kind of what's going on here.
That's right. And don't get me wrong, y'all. The ultimate point is this: Jesus himself will suffer unjust death. Probably Paul will too. I mean, it's not like they talked their way out of trouble. They eventually both gave their lives, probably, you know. So I'm not suggesting that they retaliated. I'm not saying that, but they were not silent. They were not silent. And I don't think Christians are called to silently bear injustice. I'm sorry, I just don't. When we see it, I think we need to say something. Anybody out there in video land have a thought about that? Well, I bet Lane Lakeman does.
Right on.
I know Lane. Okay, so now, remember Aristotle, Rhetoric 101, know your audience? Okay, so when he spoke to the mob, he talked about, look, I was an agent of the high priest to go get people that were, you know, sitting back. Now he looks at the Sanhedrin and he's like a lawyer in one of those old bad lawyer shows. And he realizes that half the jury are Sadducees and half are Pharisees or something like that. And oh, by the way, Sadducees, you know, did not believe in the resurrection and all that stuff. Pharisees did. And by the way, that's why the Sadducees are sad, you see. Thank you very much. You're a great audience. Okay. Okay. I spent a year of my seminary career doing Luke 20, which is Jesus dealing with the Sadducees that don't believe in the resurrection. So I have a long history with Sadducees. Okay, so he sees that there are Sadducees, and he says, I am here on account of the resurrection of the dead. And the jury goes nuts, right? At this point, if this had been a real legal setting, the judge would have dismissed the jury and, you know, hung trial, etc. But they are so mad at Paul that guess what? The Sanhedrin almost lynches him. Think about that. And guess what? The Roman soldiers go in there and whisk him out. So this happens 2 times in a row, right? When it happens with the mob in the temple, then it happens again in the Sanhedrin, and they whisk him away. And then my favorite story in all of Acts. Did you know that Paul had a sister? Did you know that Paul's sister had a son? No, you didn't until you get to Acts, 23. And it turns out that his nephew got wind of 40 Jewish guys who were really angry at Paul. And they have taken a vow of abstinence that they will not eat or drink until they capture Paul and kill him. A vow of abstinence. Now, do y'all remember Luke has given us a vow of abstinence in his account of the Last Supper, where Jesus at the Last Supper, according to Luke only, says, I will not eat again until I drink with you in the kingdom, etc. So Jesus at the Last Supper, according to Luke, does not eat and does not drink. Why? Because it'd be odd if this new interpretation of the bread is this is my body and this is my blood. It'd be kind of odd to do some self-drinking. Is that cannibalism? Anyway, so he doesn't eat or drink. And then in Luke, every resurrection appearance, guess what he does? He eats. He's standing in the middle of the disciples and he says, does anybody have anything to eat? No, I'm not kidding. So they take a vow of abstinence, which is considered in Judaism like the firmest vow you can make that says, I'm going to do this, right? Well, the nephew tells the Roman soldiers, look, my uncle is in danger of being killed by all these 40 people who want to, do him in. So guess what the Roman general does, or whatever he is, colonel? He gets a troop of about 500 soldiers, and they take him out at night, and they march him out of Jerusalem, about halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea on the coast. And then at that one place they stay overnight, and the next day they go to Caesarea. So guess what? Paul has a 500 Roman soldier escort out of Jerusalem to protect them from the 40 guys that are still hungry and thirsty. And I just love this story because Luke doesn't have to say it, but eventually these guys had to eat and drink. they had to break this vow because Paul is now in Caesarea. I love that story. I'm crazy about that story. So, okay. So now in 24, Paul is going to be in Caesarea, which is, by the way, if you ever go to Israel, I'm trying to remember who else been to Israel. Caesarea is one of the prettiest places in Israel. Do you remember going there, Art?
I'm not sure that I did or didn't.
Mm-hmm. It was a harbor that Herod the Great built. It's kind of an artificial harbor so that the Roman ships could dock there.
Yeah.
Remember that? It's kind of a circular thing. It is magnificent. It's one of the prettiest places in all of Israel. So they take him there where the governor's mansion is, and that's where really the Roman governors stay. They went to Jerusalem for the high feast and all that. So now he is going to be under Governor Felix. The Governor Felix, if some of you have been reading N.T. Wright, is an interesting dude because he was born a slave. And he was in the imperial household of Claudius. Anybody, y'all remember the PBS specials, I, Claudius? It was, Claudius was weird, saying, and his favorite people to hang around with were slaves. You know that? Claudius was really weird. And one of those slaves was Felix. And so in honor of his slave who served him well, he made him governor of Israel. And when Felix got there, he ended up marrying a princess. He stole her away from this other prince. And so now he's there in Caesarea. And this princess that he's married to is Jewish, Drusilla. Okay. And when he gets there, he hears that Paul has taken some money to Jerusalem. And eventually, that's the collection. Remember the collection for all the churches? And when he hears that, he says, I'm going to keep him in jail until he pays me a bribe. So he's hoping for some money, you know, but he seems to be fascinated by Paul. So now, okay, remember the first defense is in front of a mob. They want to kill me, you know. Then in front of the Sanhedrin, they want to kill me, you know. At least the Sadducees would have. And now he's in front of a political figure, Felix, who's an occupying governor. And now his defense gets really interesting. Look over in verse 10. Now they bring in a lawyer named Tertullus, who makes the charges that Paul has been stirring up the nation. He's been discrediting the temple. He is a bad dude, right? And here's Paul's defense in 24:10. When the governor mentioned him to speak, Paul replied, I cheerfully make my defense, Apologia, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation. As you can find out, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd, either in the synagogue or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. In other words, I am a serious Jew. Right, okay. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. I'm a Pharisee. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all people. And now, after some years, I came to bring alms, there's your money thing, to my nation and to offer sacrifices. And while I was doing this, they found me in the temple, completing the rite of purification without any crowd or disturbance. And there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation if they have anything against me. Or let these men here tell you what crime they have found when I stood before the council, unless it was this one sentence that I called out while standing before them. It is about the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you. So he recounts what he said to the Sanhedrin. I'm here because of the resurrection. And of course, what he means is the resurrection of Jesus. That's what he's pointing to. But Felix, who was well informed about the way, adjourned the meeting with the comment, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. But he kept him in custody to do a favor to the Jews. Now, this is a marvelous defense because basically he's saying all the charges that they've laid against me, they can't prove one of them. And the people who actually made the charge should be here in my presence because in Roman law, you'll love this part, I had the right to face my accusers. That's in Roman law, but they're not there. So how can these people make this charge that I kind of was upsetting the temple? That's not true. So now Felix realizes he's got this guy on his hands who knows how to defend himself. And listen how it ends up. This is 24:24. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Christ Jesus. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present. When I have opportunity, I will send for you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. And for that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Festus. And since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul. So here's a guy who's interested, apparently, or Kierkegaard defined the word dread as an antipathetic attraction, meaning you're attracted, you're horrified. You know, you're both, you know, you're really interested, but oh my God. So Felix has a dread of Paul and he keeps bringing him. Can you imagine that? This is the governor, but his wife is Jewish. That's kind of the key to that deal. She is telling him, this guy is a real Pharisee. You know, he knows what he's talking about. It's resurrection that is a dispute here. So he also goes on to talk about other things to Felix, which Felix needed to know about, which included justice, self-control, and the coming judgment. Isn't that interesting? So the defense ends up like this. He's had a mob that wanted to kill him. He goes to the Sanhedrin that ends up being a riot. And now he's at Felix's court with a Jewish wife, and the guy keeps on bringing him back. Although he wants some money. I mean, that would be nice too, right? But he wants to keep it. Isn't that fascinating? Sometimes we think of Paul as so abrasive and all that stuff. There must have been something about what he said that was interesting and engaging and sort of hooked old Felix for what he was.
And Felix didn't have the background of the Pharisees or the
No.
Sadducees. He had nothing to break down, right? So,
Well, his wife did. It says that, you know, his wife understood. And maybe the wife was the reason they kept bring that boy back, you know. So he's in jail, but in Roman jails, you had to be given a certain amount of freedom to have your friends come and bring you food and parchments and clothing and all that stuff. Because basically you didn't get anything in Roman jail. If you didn't have friends coming from the outside, you were in peck of trouble. Okay. So Paul is given that freedom. So he stays in Caesarea for 2 years. Isn't that fascinating? It's three completely different kinds of defenses. And really Luke has a portrait of Paul being really sensitive to who his audience is and how to address it. What do you think about this?
Interesting that there's no story of friends. Other times when he's in jail for 2 years.
2 years.
And there's no mention of it. He, like you said, they're free to. Other times when he's in jail, there's with.
That's right.
People coming.
That's right, yeah.
He converses with the jailers. There's
That's
none
right.
of that in this one.
No, it's not. And in other places when he's in jail with other people, like Titus is in jail with him, Timothy's in jail. But here he's alone. Yeah. And one of the questions that's raised in Pauline scholarship is, did Paul during these 2 years write what are sometimes called the prison letters? You know, that he writes Philemon, he writes Philippians, he writes Colossians, you know, there's several letters of, you know, the prison letters. They might have been written during this time. We're not sure entirely. So I am studying right now for a lecture I'm going to give this summer in the Oasis entitled A History of Christian Apologetics. So I'm reading a big thick book by Cardinal Avery Dulles. You'd be proud of me, Peter. And he's a really fine Catholic scholar. I've read a lot of his stuff. And what he does, 300, 400 pages, is he writes a history of how the church has defended itself, you know, from the very beginning. And basically, if you want to know a little preview, the church has done it basically in 3 ways. One is what's sometimes called just fideism, which is that the church will defend itself by saying, well, just believe, you know, just jump off the edge and believe. That's that. I can't defend this, just believe, right? And if you believe, then you'll understand. That's Anselm, faith, seeking understanding. But until you believe, you'll not understand. So that's what's called fideism. Fideism means faith in Latin. Okay. So that's one way. The second way has been to talk about the emptiness of a secular life. I call it the Ecclesiastes Defense, meaning you turn to the opponent and say, oh, well, you're attacking me. Let me share with you what your empty lifestyle is like. You know, Kierkegaard does this in Either Or, where he talks about the diary of a seducer is about a guy who's completely involved in the aesthetic lifestyle. And the aesthetic lifestyle means I want pleasure, I want fun, I want variety and all this stuff. And Kierkegaard looks at the aesthete and says, the biggest fear you have is boredom. So you always have to be thinking of new and different ways to have pleasure, more and more, etc. And so Kierkegaard's either or is to say, well, look at your own life, and so that's a second form of apologetics. The third form is to say, look, if you take your mind and your reason and think about this, Christianity is not irrational. It's not totally absurd like some people think it is. And part of it goes like this. Look at nature, how nature comes back around in spring and comes back up. Isn't that like resurrection? Things like that, and some people defend Christianity by not even referring to the Bible, but just, things in nature in your mind. Others say, no, reason can get you up to the point of making a leap of faith, but you finally have to take a leap of faith. Kierkegaard does that. So think of these three ways. It's fideism, you just can't believe. Look at your own life. How great is your life? And the third one says, no, reason can be enlisted into the service of Christ. Paul in Acts 17 does that a little bit when he goes to Athens, if you recall. It says, look at this altar to an unknown God, Well, let me reveal to you deeper meaning of that altar, right? So Paul kind of does that in Acts 17. Does that make sense, Or it's sometimes, by the way, a fourth one that's often done, and Paul actually does it here in the first two, in the first one, which is to say, let me tell you my story. Let me tell you how my life has changed. So fideism, sort of a look at your own life, reason that can sort of move you toward, and then the fourth really is, well, I've got a story to tell you. What do you think of that?
What is it supposed to?
Say it again.
Get it? What are those?
All of those are different forms of apology or apologetic defense of the faith. Right.
I get the first one and the third one and the fourth one. What is the second one?
Ecclesiastes one. The Ecclesiastes one says, look, you're attacking my faith, right? Okay. Well, let's just turn it around. Let's put the mirror up to your life. What's your life like? And Kierkegaard's way of doing it on the aesthetic side is you're just always looking for a new fun. And like a lot of people looking for new fun, you can never find it. You're kind of a mouse on a treadmill, and you're never going to find it. So like Kierkegaard, by the way, in Either Or, which is one of my favorite books, he says, when people say they're bored, well, what does that really mean? What does boredom mean? Does boredom mean, look, I'm all about pleasure and fun and having a quote good time? Or what does boredom mean? And so it's a tremendous amount. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the second one is more or less, well, you're attacking me. Well, let's take a look at your life. Right? Okay. So
Can you give the bigger definition of the word apologetic?
apologetics, yeah.
I keep getting hung up on.
Yeah, right, yeah. Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which literally means in Greek a defense. Defense. So when now I'll give you an example. When Socrates is accused of messing up the youth of Athens, he goes into this court setting where there's almost 500 jurors, it's all men, and he makes an apologia of his life. And by the way, if you've ever read Plato's account of the defense of Plato, by the way, Socrates' defense didn't end up so well because he ended up drinking hemlock, So this is not a successful apology. But here's what Socrates does in there. He says, you know what? Truth be told, you all worship the gods of Athens, Athena, and all the rest. He says, I got something on my shoulder that's more important than all the gods in Athens, and it's my daimon. The Greek word daimon sometimes is translated demon, but really what daimon means is I've got my own little Jiminy Cricket here on my shoulder,
That's in one of the books, children's books.
The Daimon,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's spelled
Daimon in Greek, when you do it from the Greek.
In the book I read,
Yeah.
it's Daimon.
Right.
And it represented whoever you were in
Yes.
different
Well,
shapes or.
if you saw Pinocchio, it's Jiminy Cricket. You know, so his defense goes like this. I have my own personal God, you know, that's telling me what to do. And what I offer to Athens is the truth. And you should be celebrating me. I should be getting free food from the city council every day. I should be lifted up because I am the most important voice in Athens. And he describes himself as a gadfly that's stinging a sleepy horse awake. That's his defense. So they're attacking him of screwing up the children of Athens and not honoring the gods. And here's his defense. Yeah, I got a God that's better than your God. How do you like that? And so their answer is, how about some hemlock? Literally.
The fourth one sounds to me like testimonial, like you always refer to. That we see now in the evangelical churches or
Yeah,
someone stands up. and
right.
says, this is what happened to me.
That's right.
The altar call.
Yeah. And sometimes the testimonial thing in Paul's case is what's important in Paul's testimony when he talks about his life is that he keeps going back to the fact that I was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so it's not so much once I was lost and now I'm found, once I was in the gutter and now I'm doing great. It's rather, I was always worshiping the God of Israel. I just did it wrongly and I was turned around and now I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And that's what gets Paul in trouble in his personal testimony. I grew up in the evangelical church. I've heard a million, of the testimonials. And I've often said that one of the problems of those testimonials is that, tell me then what shape your life has taken in service to God. That don't just focus on this emotional high that you've had, but now what shape is your life taking? And that's the part that's often not kind of stressed, you know what I mean? And I would say if you're using Paul as a model, you end up focusing on what? Now I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. That's the part that's important, at least it seems to me.
Going to churches trying to regain that, that thing.
That sense of mission, that sense of purpose, right? So okay, defense, just fideism, just believe because I tell you to believe. Your life might have some holes in it, yourself. By the way, in Augustine's Confessions, part of his confession is when he says, oh Lord, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. And he describes his sort of restless searching for the truth, that sort of thing. So in a sense, Augustine's Confessions is in this kind of Ecclesiastes book. The third one being, look, you can use reason to get you to the lip of faith. And faith, you can discover, is not just irrational. By the way, if any of you have read C.S. Lewis's autobiography entitled Surprised by Joy is his intellectual quest that got him to the lip of faith. And then eventually he takes the lip of faith. And then the fourth, again, it's just, here's my story, and I've been changed, and now I invite you to consider this too.
It seems like you got them out of order. That third one you use is reason.
Yeah.
Takes you to the lip of faith.
Yeah.
Faith takes you to where you can get it, I guess.
Yeah.
And then you can argue against other people who, the Epicureans, if you will.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Well, here's what I would say to y'all. Ultimately, when we talk about our faith and think about Paul, what he's finally trying to argue for, if you look carefully at these 3 chapters, he's arguing for the resurrection of the dead. It's not so much about me, myself, and I, you know, life in heaven and all that stuff. It's rather, I am here on account of the resurrection of the dead. So his defense ultimately is like this. I'm a Jew. I am a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And oh yeah, by the way, I've experienced the resurrection of the dead. So you think about his defense is saying, this is who I am, and it's been confirmed. Lane, you have something to say there, brother? No? I thought you were about to jump on that one. Okay.
So, but in that resurrection of the dead, it's only referring to Jesus.
Paul later in 1 Corinthians 15 will link up the resurrection of Jesus to the hope of us all being resurrected, yeah. But not in this section, yeah. Does this help? I would say this, anybody who's a person of faith, I think they have to actually sit down and think to themselves, why do I believe? Why do I believe? You know, there's one form of apologia that's I didn't mention because I think it's so ludicrous. I call it, see what beautiful stones there are here in the temple. It's an argument that goes like this. Well, Christianity's been around 2,000 years. Look at the big, beautiful buildings we built, the universities, the hospitals, the colleges, you know, and look how strong we are. Gosh, we're almost 2 billion people. I call it look how large the stones are. And the reason I have problems with that is real simple. I studied a lot of church history, and you have to have a strong stomach to study church history.
It's not all good stuff.
Because all those big, beautiful stones, there's some really bad rocks and pebbles and mud.
Bloodstained rocks.
Bloodstained rocks, yeah. So for every giant stone, there's this, well, I need to explain what happened there. It was, you know, they didn't mean it. And my point is just to talk about the grandeur. I mean, hey, y'all, if it was about grandeur, honestly, as much as I've traveled Turkey and other places in the Middle East, the grandeur of the mosque in the Middle East will knock your socks off. You know, if it's just about grandeur, well, that's a good case to be made. Or if my son, who's just been in Thailand, the grandeur of the Buddhist temples, you know, we've been around since, you know, how is that an argument?
Yeah.
Because they're lovely stones.
Some of the Indian ones are pretty impressive too.
Yeah, I mean, really. So anyway, so I'm not real enamored by the big stones.
Hey, what about, and I'm in this quote, in the C.S. Lewis books, Puddleglum makes an argument.
So say again.
Puddleglum in the silver chair.
Say more.
And what he says basically, my world may be imaginary,
Yeah.
but your real world doesn't really get to my imaginary. It's
Well-
basically his apology for why he believes what he does.
That's right.
I'm misquoting it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
Well, actually, C.S. Lewis wrote 2 different kind of fantasies. He wrote a children's fantasy, Narnia, and then he wrote a space trilogy. And his point is that he wanted to defend the faith by telling winsome stories. And he used to say that when he looks at a secular person, he says, there's a watchful dragon guarding the heart of every, you know, secularist. And when I tell these stories, I am sneaking past watchful dragons to come in the back door, you know. So his defense was to use stories, right? Yeah. So, okay.
There's actually a New York Times opinion piece, I think, this week about religion being something as a fantasy. But if you think about fantasy in childhood,
Yeah.
how much better it makes a
Yeah.
child's life, how
Yeah.
it enriches it. So,
Sure.
so for the people who are so logical, they can't believe that even the concept
Absolutely.
of religion is fantasy, it lets you live a better life,
Absolutely.
a richer life.
By the way, in this lecture this summer, I want to talk about Frederick Buechner's famous lecture entitled "The Gospel is Comedy, Tragedy, and Fairy Tale." And he looks at the fairy tales. And he says that ultimately the fairy tales are about two things. There's danger out there in the wilderness, the wolf and all that stuff, but they always end up and they lived happily ever after, So fairy tales talk about the darkness and they promise the light. It's a great lecture, by the way. If you ever want to read a great book, read Frederick Buechner's The Gospel is Comedy, Tragedy, and Fairy Tale. We'll talk more about it next week. Okay, so next week, we'll move on to Paul's next adventures, because there are going to be some great adventures. If you like shipwrecks and all that, oh my gosh, we've got it for you, okay? So let's pray together. Lord, we're grateful to be here. Bless us. Give us good hopes and good courage. In Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Frank.
You're welcome. See you guys. Or you know how to turn that
Didn't
off.
get your name. What's
I know, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Good. Welcome to the best Sunday school teacher.
Okay.
I can, you want me to, I can turn it on.
He's great and entertaining too.
Entertainment. That's me, man.
Gotta be entertaining or it ain't any good.
Entertainment value.
That sounds smart.
Are you doing your commission here?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's right.
This is